Hello everyone, welcome to today's webinar, Operational Resilience, What is the Exam Question? We will begin our presentation in a couple of minutes. We're just going to allow everybody to join us. Going to give it one more minute for any latecomers and then we'll begin our presentation. Thank you for waiting. Right then. Hi everyone, thank you for joining us for today's webinar. My name is Nikki Soudan, and before we get started, I'd like to review a few housekeeping notes. Number one, all phone lines are on mute to avoid interruptions during the broadcast. Number two, our session today will include a live Q&A session at the end. You may submit your questions at any time during the presentation using the questions panel located to the bottom of your screen. And finally, the recording will be available on our website within the next few business days. Thank you. I'd also like to give those of you that may not be familiar with RiskConnect, I'd like to provide a brief introduction. So RiskConnect is the leading integrated risk management software solutions provider. Our technology empowers organizations with the ability to anticipate, manage and respond in real time to strategic and operational risks across the extended enterprise. In July last year, RiskConnect announced the acquisition of Castellan to better fulfill the ultimate goal of bringing risk under one roof. Together, Castellan and RiskConnect will help you build integrated risk management functions with end-to-end visibility and true enterprise resilience through software, consulting, and managed services. Now, before we begin the discussion again, I'd like to once again remind everyone to submit any questions you may have at any time using the webinar question panel on the bottom of your screen. We'll take as many questions as we can at the end of the presentation. Thank you. I'd now like to introduce and welcome our presenters for today's broadcast. Our first presenter is Paul Cutler. Paul Cutler is the EMEA Managing Consultant for Risk Connect. Paul has over 40 years' experience within the IT service industry, working in New Zealand, Australia, and the United Kingdom. He has a background in business continuity and resilience, and his experience includes uplifting a client's technical recovery capability following attack and supporting clients to operationalize their ITDR and cyber recovery solutions. Next up, we have Andrew Moorcock. Andrew is also a UK-based lead consultant for Risk Connect. He has worked in the resilience sector for over 25 years and specialises in the development and testing of highly effective, simple, meaningful and flexible business continuity and incident management systems and solutions, tailored to align perfectly with operational resilience, organisational strategy and meeting customer requirements. And last up, we have Ken Clark. Ken is a senior consultant with Risk Connect based in the UK. His background is with blue chip companies in technology, banking and oil, and he has over 25 years, he has designed, implemented and managed BCM programs in Asia, Africa, the EU, Middle East, North America and the UK and Ireland. Ken has developed and delivered training and awareness of BCM and crisis management across organisations, including C-suite and board members. In addition to his BCM and crisis roles, Ken is also a member of the BCI East of England Management Committee. So without further ado, I'd like to pass you over to our presenters for today's broadcast. Thank you.
Thank you, Nikki. So the session today is really, we've been talking amongst ourselves. BCI wanted to do another webinar about OpRes, and we were talking amongst ourselves in the office or remotely in the office, if you want to call it that. And really one of the things we've found after talking to a lot of our customers out there is there just seems to be an awful lot of noise and confusion around operational resiliency, self-assessment, how much should I do, how little should I do, how many important business services. So we just thought we'd take the opportunity today to have a 1 hour session just to go through some of our thoughts on operational resilience, specifically looking at ensuring your operational resilience requirements are balanced, cost effective. Sorry, Nikki, go back again.
Sorry, apologies.
Go back again. Thank you. Looking at focus on more critical aspects of the operations without overthinking the requirements or eliminating excessive complexity, and also eliminating it, but also avoiding of over delivery on the exam question. Next slide, please, Nikki. So really covering what is operational resilience, so this is a UK FCA PRA regulation question, so we're not looking at DORA, MAS, anything outside the UK at the moment, just keeping it quite simple as here. We're kind of assuming the majority of the audience will be from the UK or Ireland area. Next question we really had was we've had customers who aren't overcooking, but blinding the regulator with copious amounts of data. Is that a good strategy? Then we'll look at some good practice, and as Nikki said, we'll have a Q&A at the end. So please put any questions you've got into the Q&A button. I think it's about the center of your screen. Just type it in there and we can see it. Nikki, please. Okay. Let's just baseline ourselves here. So this is what we see operational resilience as. So it's the ability of an organization to continue to provide business services in the face of adverse operational events by anticipating, preventing, recovering from and adapting to such events and learning from them. That's basically what OpRes is in a nutshell, and that's what we kind of reading out as a pragmatic approach. Next slide, please, Nikki. So what we thought we'd do is look at, I guess, what let's refer to as the main regulatory clauses within the FCA's 15A regulations, and just kind of provide a little bit of color around each of them. So the first one is the obvious one, that a firm must identify its important business services. So the plan is that I'm going to sort of raise each regulation up, then pass the ball across to Ken and to Andrew to kind of add a bit of color to it. And then it'll come back to me and we'll flip around and keep going through there. So basically, we all know we've got to identify our important business services. So Andrew, first up, thoughts, please. Andrew? No, you're on mute, Andrew. Good start.
There we are. So yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Paul. Okay, important business services. So what are they? So of course, this is a very subjective question, and each organization is going to have a very different answer. But essentially, this comes down to, when it comes to this regulation, impacts not to your organization, but to downstream end users. It could be to the market participants, but essentially looking at it from their lens. And what's important to do when you're identifying business services, important business services, is to have a subjective approach. In other words, you decide what an important business service is, but also once you've done that, have an objective metric system so that you can measure everything equally. And then you may be able to identify important business services kind of in order to say, this is the most important thing that we do, going down to the least most important business service that we do. And it's all about intolerable harm. So that's the if you like, the cliff edge at which something becomes, as I say, an impact that needs to be mitigated. So it's all about intolerable business harm across, the consumer base. Think about something like a bank. An important business service might be something, the ability to withdraw cash. It's not something like payment processing, AML, auditing. Those are processes. So essentially, and things like HR and payroll are not considered to be important business services either.
Okay. Ken, thoughts?
Yeah, I would just hark back to the statement that you made earlier, Paul, on the previous slide about what is operational resilience, and it talks about the delivered outcomes that come from that. In traditional BC, we would look at the impact of an event, an incident, internally to our own organization. The difference with OpRes is you have to get your head around what could the impact be to the wider market. It's not just can we recover, it's what would be the impact be to the wider market, the wider community.
Okay, that's good. So one of the other questions that always comes up is, and this is back to Andrew's point a second ago about HR, payroll, regulatory reporting. I mean, yes, they may be important, but does your customer care if you can't report your regulatory reporting? Will they actually care if you can't pay your staff? Yes, you should be paying your staff, as Andrew says, it's a process. However, is it a process that helps you deliver a service? So, and then we come to how many have I got? So about a month ago, I think it was, BCI released their OpRes report. I think it was about a month ago. And one of the things they looked at, one of the questions they had was looking at how many business services should we have, which is a very good question. Now, it came back with a range of anywhere between unsure, which was about 12% of respondents. The majority is between 6 and 25. So it's, somewhere between that number is a sweet spot. And LMA, the Lloyd's Marketing Association, they kind of have telling their members that's where it should roughly be. So there are people who responded with greater than 251 services. They're getting far too granular. You've got to really understand what are we delivering to our consumers and what actually is important in today. So back to Andrew's point, when you have a bank, your important business, it could be as simple as, can a customer get money? Can they see a balance? Can they pay a bill? That's the key things. You really got to drill into it and really kick the tires hard to ask yourself the question, is it important or is it just business service? That way you can actually report on it. So next slide, please, Nikki. Right, and this is the bit that Andrew just said a second ago about impact tolerance. So for every one of your important business services, you've got to set an impact tolerance, and that is the maximum level of acceptable pain you're willing to accept to deliver that service. And if you exceed it, you're going to actually affect the customers, the market, or actually threaten your organization's viability. Andrew, you might as well go first again. You love this.
Okay, so where we say an impact tolerance, when we say an impact tolerance, we're talking about a single regulated firm. So if you are a single regulated firm, you may be FCA regulated, so you need to come up with one impact tolerance. And generally speaking, impact tolerances are time-based. Other metrics feed into that time-based metric, but obviously, as I say, for a single regulated firm, you need to come up with one impact tolerance. If you're a dual regulated entity, so FCA and PRA, you may need to come up with two separate impact tolerances. That's not necessarily the case in the sense that they could be the same, but you need to make sure when you're doing your regulatory reporting that you can evidence the fact that you have tested against market integrity as well as end consumer harm. So FCA, PRA, Bank of England, those metrics can be the same, but you need to, as I say, evidence that you have considered both. There you go. So,
Ken?
Yeah, and when you're setting the impact tolerance, it's not a competition. It's not trying to get as low an impact tolerance as possible. Think about at what cost would you need to go to have a reasonable impact tolerance for your important business systems. Now, by that, traditionally in BC, again, we tend to look to get everything back up as quickly as possible. That's not necessarily the case with op resilience. You want to be able to achieve that tolerance level at a level that you are pretty sure that you can achieve if you ever need to. So don't set yourself unrealistic goals.
And to that point, for example, you may have decided that you're going to do a cyber event as your plausible scenario to set your impact tolerance. Well, if you're willing to push the impact tolerance out because of a cyber event, but then on other situations you want to bring it in a bit quicker, for example, a hurricane or a natural disaster or political unrest, you've got to decide. As Ken said, it's not. You don't get extra points for being the quickest. You get points for meeting your commitments, which is we will make sure we can recover within X amount of time. So similar, back to the point, the second one to the bottom is about RTOs. You've got to make sure that you can actually recover within your impact tolerance. So it's all very well and good setting an impact tolerance of a week, but if you can't recover all of the processes, all of the activities needed to deliver that service, how is that going to be achievable? So you need to make sure that you're being realistic and practical, and you can actually prove it, because that's what the regulator wants to see, is that you've thought about it, you understand it. Now that could be as simple as we will go through manual workarounds for a week, but we're going to still survive. That's fine. But what you're doing here is you're actually providing the regulator with confidence. You understand what your important business services are and what the impacts, you understand what the impacts will be to your customers and when, to Andrew's point earlier, which are time-based.
I'll just jump in there just quickly.
Of course.
To that point, when you're thinking about your impact tolerance, you need to look at each one of those consumers and look at the one that has the impact tolerance that's most severe, in other words, intolerable harm at the quickest time. So it could be somebody, let's just say you're looking at paying a bill. So you look at the different types of bill and say, well, actually, some people might need to pay a mortgage. And if they don't pay that mortgage, they go into default and they could lose their home, against something like, as I say, paying your Netflix bill. So it's important to make sure that we look at each one of those user bases, come up with the intolerable harm as defined, as the organization has defined it subjectively, and then go from there to make sure that the impact tolerance is at the lowest common denominator.
Cool. Thanks, Andrew. Next slide, please. Thank you. Okay, and then the next one comes down. So if you're going to set it, you need to make sure you can remain within it. So in the event of severe but plausible disruption. So Ken, you're first this time.
Yeah, sure. So the first bullet there talks about, you need to be able to confirm that you can meet your impact tolerances. And the way to do that is to test against the worst case plausible scenario. We're not talking about, and one of the future slides it talks about end to end, but what we're talking about here is you wouldn't take down a complete important business service to try to prove you can recover it. So this is where the plausible scenario comes in, and you've got to think about how you're going to provide the evidence that you can meet the impact tolerances that you've said you can.
Yeah, and that's one of the key points is the regulator said here that you must, you've got to be able to make sure we come to one testing a bit later on, but the regulator doesn't say testing at all costs. What they say is testing to prove you can remain within. Andrew, anything you want to add to that one?
Yeah, well, just briefly, when it talks about resuming a degraded service, obviously, depending on your user base, it may well be that there are certain parts of that user base that can come back from intolerable harm with a degraded service. So when we're talking about impact tolerance, we need to make sure that those scenarios that we are thinking about can also involve resumption of a degraded service. So essentially bringing one or two services back online may assist some of your customer base.
Yeah. And remembering that while you are in a degraded service, you may be building backlog, which you'll need to get on top of to get back to where you're performing as BAU. Next slide, please, Nikki. Right, this is stating the obvious in BC world, really. Ken, again, maybe you first.
Yeah, sure. So having a good business continuity strategy in place is fundamental to having a good op-res. You shouldn't have to build something completely new to answer the op-res questions. You're using the strategy. If you've had the right strategies in place in designing your BC program in the first place, they should stand you in good stead. And the key one to remember as well is the proportionality to the firm's activities, as Andrew mentioned just previously. You might not want to get everything back. You're not necessarily looking at gold-plated solution. You've got to understand what would be proportionate and appropriate.
Yep, agreed. And that's it, is proportionate to nature, scale, and complexity of your business. If you are a small firm, then you need to be managing your important business. You're not going to have 200 important business services if you're a small firm. You mainly have one or two. If you're a large corp, you're a large trading firm, you could have 12, 15. Be proportionate. Again, there's no points to overstate. When keep it proportionate, keep it pragmatic, be realistic. Next slide, please, Nikki. Right, this is one of the key ones that we're going to talk about a lot, I think. So 15A41 is really about that you need to, one of the key things, once you've identified your important business service and the activities or the processes that deliver that service, be they third party or internal or however you want to do it, outsourced, you need to be able to identify the people, the process, technology, facilities, and information needed to deliver each of those important business services. So there needs to be sufficient that you can identify the vulnerabilities and remedy those as appropriate. I'll pass this one to Andrew for the first off. If you
okay, so when we've heard the term end-to-end, that is mentioned in some of the regulations, but what it doesn't state and what's become conflated is the term end-to-end and mapping. So when we talk about end-to-end, what we're talking about is the identification of the service from the consumer end. So if you like, right from where it's being consumed all the way down into the business, if you like, the level 1 activities that support that important business service. There is a requirement to identify each of those elements and how they support that important business service. There's never been a requirement to create an end-to-end service map of those processes. So essentially, when we talk about end-to-end, again, we're talking about those level 1 services. And then when it comes to granularity, we're talking about those things that directly affect. When you think about a service, it may be supported by other processes within the organization. The granularity is a maturity model that comes over time. Essentially, to begin with, we're talking about end-to-end process identification. So op-res, when it comes to end-to-end, there's a thing called, it's called illusory truth, essentially. When something is said often enough, it becomes the truth. If you want to look it up, there's a thing called the body temperature of a chicken experiment that was done by researchers, where essentially, if you say something, it becomes part of the lexicon of that market segment, and end-to-end mapping becomes truth, even though nobody's ever said it. And what makes it worse when things like that happen is if it's sensible and logical, and end-to-end mapping seems like a sensible thing to do, it becomes more and more likely that you'll believe that that is a requirement when it's not. All we need to do is identify the processes from an end-to-end perspective that support that important business service.
And that's the key, because end-to-end, as Andrew said, has sort of become the phrase that people use. I mean, and logically, when you look at it, I need to understand the end-to-end process, but it's really about understanding each component or each activity that you've got and the downstream analysis of what's there. So, and using, for example, the underlying business impact analysis for that activity. What does it take to deliver that service? The people, the process, technology, etc., all identified there. Ken, have you got anything you want to include in here?
Yeah, I was saying that, when you identify and document everything that makes up your IBSs, it's not a once and done. It's not a checkbox exercise. Any change to your organization or any change to the market or your clients could have an impact on your IBSs and the tolerances that would be acceptable in that. So it's not a once and done. It's something that you have to keep monitoring and changing as and when it needs to.
Yep. So there is a requirement for a annual self-assessment, but there's also a requirement. It's similar. How often do you redo your BIAs? I mean, one of the things that actually says is if there's a material change to the business, you should be reviewing it. Well, logically, you should be looking at this every year because the business does change. If they don't change, how are they growing? So, and when you get into the drilling into the dependencies, you're looking at a lot of organizations nowadays, are putting things in the cloud and they're outsourcing it. But, so what about, you've got the third parties could be part of the processes that you've got, but what about the fourth party? What about the parties that are delivering services to your third party to deliver the important business service? Should we be considering those, Andrew, do you think?
Well, when it comes to, if you think back to standard business continuity management, when we look at the critical supply chain, we would, if we're doing it properly, we would look at the resilience testing and the business continuity plans of that critical supply chain to ensure that we've adequately answered that question. Are they able to support us when they have an incident? We don't then say, right, we need to then extend that into their critical supply chain, because obviously, where do you stop? So to answer that question, I don't think so. I think once you've identified those third parties that support you, making sure that you've adequately tested or at least viewed their business continuity plans and their test results, I think that's probably as far as you need to go.
Okay, good, thanks. We've got a few questions coming in, so a couple we'll answer a bit later on, but one I think is actually quite pertinent now and good spot to put it in. So, guys, if you look on the screen, Q6, so there's a lady who asked the question, I'm struggling to differentiate operational resilience from business continuity. For me, operational resilience is basically business continuity as the operational resilience plan is part of business continuity plan. Andrew, can you see that on your screen?
I'm just reading it now.
Okay, good. So Ken, did you want to go first while Andrew reads, if you've already seen it, maybe?
Just give me a second, sorry.
I just thought we'd jump in here, so before we jump to the next slide, Nikki.
Yeah, no problem at all.
Yeah, so for me, I'm exactly the same position. When OpRes was first being talked about, it just seemed to me to be, well, that's a good business continuity program. That's what it is there. And it took me a while to understand that it's less about being able to recover, and it's more about understanding what the potential impact is. So it's a different set of questions that you need to consider. They are, you can't just look internally. You've got to look wider. So I think that's the difference for me. Business continuity, you just want to get your stuff back up and running as quickly as possible. OpRes, it's a much wider canvas that you've got to look at.
Yep. So, and my take is I always look at, I kind of visualize the difference, Sharon, being business continuity, you have BIAs, you have departments, you have BCP plans. And if you look at each of those departments or teams or the structures as verticals, and each one of those is delivering a very insular service, could be HR, could be payroll, could be accounts payable, could be any one of those things. However, when you look at OpRes is delivering a service which may use an activity in every single department. So it's almost as if you visualized your verticals are your BIAs sitting there on a screen. Your OpRes literally is sliding through each of those, picking up the activities as it goes along, delivering from left to right. So that is really the services delivery versus so again, to Ken's point, it's the services being delivered externally, not internally, if that makes sense. So you're really considering everything but yourself. Andrew, do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, so essentially the difference, operational resilience is a piece of terminology that's been around for a very long time. It's only when sort of 2018 when we started to think about operational resilience as a regulatory requirement for financial organizations. So operational resilience became its new entity when we started to think about end consumer and market impacts. So when we think about operational resilience, now we're looking at the resilience of the organization from the end user perspective and making sure that the services that we supply and support to that end user have been adequately mapped, so we ensure that we don't impact and have intolerable harm to that end consumer. So it's no longer BC where we're looking at protecting the organization. That's, if you like, standard business continuity management. Operational resilience adds that consumer lens to make sure that we're not impacting externally upstream to a consumer or obviously to the wider market.
Cool. Thanks, Andrew. Right, I think we'll move on and we'll get some more of these questions at the end, so thank you for that. Next slide, please, Nikki. Okay, scenario testing. So this is 5.3. You need to actually test and prove against your plausible scenarios to test it, and you've got to be able to remain. So this is where you, similar to you did with BC where you did recovery plans, but this is actually proving you can remain. Now this could be a desktop, it could be any way you want to do it. So Andrew, severe but plausible.
Well, absolutely, but when we think about severe but plausible, we need to think about scenarios, both those that you can remain within your impact tolerances. So you like a safe test where you look at a scenario and say, we think we can stay within our impact tolerances if we have this scenario. It's important to also make sure that we have scenario testing that you expect will make you fail on your impact tolerances. So you can run that exercise, run that test, and make sure you learn from that failure. And of course, when we're thinking about scenarios, we need to make sure that we've thought about things that have happened to our own organization, those crisis or black swan events that have happened to us in the past, and also things that have happened to other similar organizations in the market. So essentially the difference between scenario tests when it comes to op-res is different from business continuity and DR testing, because DR testing from BC and testing for BC and DR is all about protecting the organization and making sure that we don't damage the organization. Again, going back to the previous point, this is about testing against intolerable harm to the upstream elements that are reliant on our important business services. And now obviously we're thinking about institutions, the market, and end consumers. So again, identifying who is going to be affected and when, and making sure that we test against those. One more point. So when it comes to scenario testing, make sure you start simple. Whilst it's easy to jump in the deep end and have chaos, and that seems like a good test, the regulator is not expecting these tests to be comprehensive and complete now. Obviously, by March 2025, all this testing needs to have been done. And the last point I would say is it's important to start now. So we can't cliffhang, because the regulator has stated if we come across an organization that's done nothing by September 2024 and expects to do it all in Q4 24, that's not enough. If you are not doing the testing now, if you're not making sure that you've got a proper testing regime in place, that does constitute a breach of the FCA's regulations.
Thank you very much.
And I was just going to say, Paul, that no, I totally agree with what Andrew's saying there about you need to be testing now, but be sensible about what you're trying to test. Do it in small chunks to begin with. Build up to the right level of test that's appropriate for you, but don't go for the all or nothing sort of test early on. Understand what it is you're trying to prove, and then build on that. Each time you should be building a bit more complexity into your testing.
Okay, next slide, please, Nikki. Okay, so this is, I think, coming back to Andrew's point a minute ago, which is 5.4, is do the research yourself. Look internally at your history, your industry. There was a question though, which I think we could probably get to now, which I am just trying to find. Here we go. Yeah, so we could probably use as example. So you seem focused on services companies. How does this work for, say, an engineering company? So Andrew, to put you on the spot, or Ken, can you think of a scenario testing, a plausible scenario that could actually be what an engineering company should be thinking about from an operational resilience perspective?
Well, yeah. So when we're thinking about operational resilience as an extension of business continuity management, it's often said that OpRes is BC done well. But when it comes to operational resilience from a financial services sector basis, we're thinking about end consumers and the market and market viability. When we're talking about something like an engineering company, they may well not be regulated by the FCA, PRA, or Bank of England, or under DORA or MAS. However, they may be part of the strategic national critical infrastructure of a nation state. So we need to make sure that from an engineering company's perspective, if they are supporting something like critical national infrastructure, say they're a power provider, they've identified in exactly the same way what would be intolerable harm to that part of the SNCI or to government, whatever it might be. The principles are the same. Identifying intolerable harm, identifying the important business services that you provide. It's not necessary to do operational resilience to have a regulator, or if you do have a regulator, it's not necessary that operational resilience and the regulator necessarily have to meld.
Agreed.
And if you look back to the Japanese earthquake a few years ago and the impact that had on engineering manufacturing, I don't think many people would have planned that size of a problem into their thinking. And this is where, when you talk about what's appropriate, you've really got to try and look back in your history, but also try and do a bit of future gazing as well.
Yeah, agreed. And I guess one of the key things, again, we're trying to make for this webinar is be realistic and be pragmatic. If you're not in a hurricane, or a tornado alley, then you don't really, that's not a realistic scenario. If you are likely to be targeted, which pretty much everybody is with a cyber attack, that's probably a good plausible scenario. Civil unrest, depending on where you are, or even, mass evacuation of buildings in the case of COVID. So there's a lot of things that you can look back on your history and also talk to executives, find out what's worrying them. Next slide, please, Nikki. Okay, so Ken, do you want to go first on this one?
Yeah, sure. So the screen hasn't gone up, sorry. Whenever we do testing, whenever we have an event, lessons learned is a phrase that comes out all the time. You need to make sure that it doesn't become a finger pointing exercise. Make sure it is learning that you're coming out from that, and don't spend weeks trying to pull any sort of testing report together. Get it done quickly, succinctly, and share it, and get the feedback from people to help show what actions you can do to further improve your operational resilience.
Andrew?
Yeah, so just as Ken said, it's important to make sure that it's an open and frank conversation. We have a thing in the UK essentially called Charterhouse Rules. That's essentially where what you say will be recorded, but who said it isn't. So when we're having an after action review, or having a hot incident debrief, or again, an operational disruption lessons learned exercise, it's important that everybody's rank and status is left at the door, and that there's a full and frank conversation to make sure that we've learned all of our lessons, and those lessons are recorded, and we can prove either we've remained within our impact tolerances or evidenced why we fell outside them, and obviously make efforts to remain within those impact tolerances. What I would say about that and about documentation in general is that thinking that, and we see this a lot actually from when we look at organizations and their documentation, is that blinding the regulator with huge and copious amounts of information might seem like a good plan because you have lots of information and you perceive it to be useful. Throwing that into a system or using that to support your regulatory requirements is never a good idea. Think simple, and obviously only have the information in there that's worthwhile. And again, like this, only answer the exam question.
And I think as well, so to the lessons learned, yeah, make sure that, and this is one of the requirements that the regulator has, is that if you do have any actions, make sure they're assigned to somebody, because when you come back again, you need to be able to make sure that person has actually updated it, fixed it. If one of those is we need to improve the RTO, we need to improve the resilience on a bit of technology, then make sure that there's a plan in place to make that happen. So when you come around again, you have actually learnt the lesson. So you shouldn't be going for 100% day one. You're setting yourself up for failure. As Ken said, do small wins, but still wins. Keep going and keep building as you go and get better and better and better until you are comfortable. And you may get to a point where you are comfortable hitting the red button and taking the whole business down to see if you can recover services. If you can get to that point of your confidence level is that high, that's brilliant. But again, you don't need to get there if it's at all costs. Next slide, please, Nikki. Okay, so one of the other key ones is about having a communication strategy. So this is, again, it's good business continuity practice, making sure that you've actually got a strategy. So who are you going to tell, what are you going to tell, and have a plan. So, for example, there's one there. There are a number of examples pretty much everyone on this call would have seen where communications has gone wrong and communications has gone well. One of the probably examples is probably Ferrari when they got hit by a cyber attack, I think it was. They got on the front foot and acknowledged they had been and let the customers know what they were doing to get on with it. Giving the customers confidence back, and being positive, as opposed to trying to hide it and pretend it's not happening. You've got to be on the front foot. So, so Andrew, anything you want to add on the communication from a crisis management even perspective, perhaps?
Oh, yeah, I mean, it's obviously communicate when if you've been involved in incidents after action reviews, number 1 or 2 on the agenda is always communications and the failure of communications. So it's important, vitally important, that the communications element is thought out in advance. You have decision trees, you have call trees, and they are properly exercised and properly tested. What it's also important to do is make sure that communications are well managed from an organizational perspective, and we have identified key individuals and talking heads who are able to make statements for the organization, and that we don't have the Wild West when everybody is wanting to make a statement to the media. Again, holding statements can be drafted in advance. It's important that we have something boilerplated so that we can pick things like industry information, company status, company data, etc., that we can piece together holding statements quickly in advance. Again, look at what other organizations have done well and organizations that have done things very badly. Usually when organizations get in trouble, it's through a lack of communication rather than oversharing.
Ken, any thoughts?
Again, just reiterating what Andrew said, bad communication can make a problem far worse than it needed to be. So making sure that you know how you're going to communicate, who's going to communicate, and have alternative options there as well is absolutely key. I think Andrew had an example of KFC. I think that was an example you're going to use.
Yeah, where they ran out of chicken, but they turned that. I think from memory, they actually bizarrely ran out of chicken. Yet they turned it around and actually made it a positive. I've got no idea how, but I don't really eat KFC, but people do. So they turned the whole thing around into a positive, and actually, in fact, if anything, increased their brand awareness quite dramatically, just by being on the front foot and acknowledging, hey, fair call, we've been hit. This is what's happened. This is what we're going to do to fix it. And everyone jumped on it, which was good. Anything? So maybe go to the next slide. I'm just conscious of time. Nikki, please.
Yeah, we've got 15 minutes left.
Great, thanks. Can you go next slide, please?
Of course. Right then, this is just my bit, Paul, and then I'll hand you back over.
Yeah, sure.
So before we begin our question and answer session, I'd just like to highlight one of our recent content pieces on operational resilience that a lot of people have found very useful and is full of valuable information. So this white paper is designed to help you remain operationally resilient by providing an in-depth analysis of all existing and upcoming operational resilience regulations and best practices. Within, you'll find an examination of the practices introduced through various regulations in the financial sector, reviews of the commonalities and differences between regulations and regulators, and the best practices that can be applied to all sectors, regulated or not. It's available to download today. I'll pop the link in the chat during this session, or you can visit our website, riskconnect.com, for more useful resources. Right, now it's time for our question and answer session. We've already received lots of good questions, so without further ado, I'll pass you back on to Paul. Thank you.
Thank you, Nikki. Right, so just exactly to bizarrely, Nikki, by good segue is, so question 4 on the Teams site, guys, I just popped it in there. So the question was from someone I can't actually read further down, was, considering the UK-based banking group that operates across various jurisdictions such as the US and Hong Kong, should we take into account the local regulatory expectations when establishing impact tolerance statements for an integrated banking system? For example, if the group's ITS is set at that's impact tolerance at 24 hours, but Hong Kong management suggests an approach of 8 hours, or cautiously, should we aim to align by adopting the shorter time frame, or is it preferable to maintain separate impact tolerance for each country? Andrew?
It's a great question. Not having read the HKMA regulations in the last week or so, what I would say off the cuff is it's important to make sure that you are aligning with local regulation. Obviously, if you're an international organization, you will have standards that you need to meet across the board, and obviously the lowest RTO is a sensible one if you have services that are being delivered globally. So if, let's just say, HKMA said 8 hours, and you had a system being driven out of Cupertino, you say 8 hours. But obviously, for parts of the IT stack that are not going to Hong Kong, you can ignore, obviously, the HKMA, if you like, or 8-hour RTO. So, to answer the question, I think absolutely you should be adhering to local regulatory standards.
And to that point, with the Edge of Singapore, with MAS, it needs to be very clear what services are being delivered out of Singapore. If it's part of your supply chain, then what services you're doing and how you're doing it. The regulator in Singapore is very strict on what has actually been delivering, because we need to understand what we need to be looking at. APRA, when it comes online soon, will also be very similar with the Australian market. So it's really, if you've got so we've got a number of customers in the business we're in BCNR within Risk Connect, where they are US based, yet they have branches in the UK. They are working to the UK regulations for those branches. So that's what actually manages where the service is being delivered to the consumer. But which market are you actually in? So you need to understand your markets and your segments, or where you're actually approaching. Ken, did you want to add anything to before we do the next one? Next question.
Obviously, some locations might get a surprising benefit if you try to meet the shortest tolerance for another location, but it comes down again to you don't have to break the bank in coming up with the tolerances. So if it makes sense to offer a quicker or shorter tolerance level globally, because one location needs to do it, but don't be pulled into thinking you have to do everything for everywhere in the same time scales.
Okay, that's good. Thank you, Ken. So next question, he says, looking here is, we've actually answered that one. Okay, so how do we ensure OpRes is embedded as part of our organizational culture?
For me, I think part of that comes down to what's the reporting line for the people who are doing OpRes. There was an earlier question that asked where should OpRes and BCM sit in the organization. I think if you want to get it embedded, you have to have the right stakeholders at the top. And I think that if you put it into a specific type of function, it'd be more difficult. You know, BC has been in security, facilities, IT, various times. I think it needs to be a direct line into the COO of an organization. And that way it can help to drive that embedding it into the DNA across the whole organization.
Okay, and to that point, I mean, it's looking at, again, the BCI OpRes report they had here is, you know, day-to-day lead for OpRes is normally assumed of business continuity. So 20% of the respondents responded that the BC manager is responsible for OpRes. You've got 11% for head of resiliency, coming to the COO. The scary part was, in fact, some even had the CRO at 6%, operations director, and in some cases, worryingly, more than one person was accountable, which was almost 10% of the respondents. So again, it's what we tend to do, what we do at Risk Connect is really look at, we drive it from the top. So we get executive buy-in. We make sure that, I mean, at the end of the day, the executive and the management have decided the impact tolerances. They have decided, and you ratified it with them, what they are. So everything should be feeding downhill from the executive that these are our important business services. This is the expectation. This is our impact tolerance, because that's what we see strategically the business doing. And it's up to everyone below that to be delivering on that tactically, I think. Next question was, hold on, I'm just trying to come down the page here. Sorry, Nikki's clicked every one of them, so I can't tell which one I'm answered or not. So here goes, a long one here. In my experience of real-world harm, I spent a lot of time in a CTO role in one of the large Wall Street banks. A lot of the problems were caused by overemphasis on testing, the primary application delivering the important business services. In the majority of real-world failure scenarios, complex interdependent environments, impact was caused by upstream dependencies, which I think with the consensus of moving towards end-to-end would be useful. If we don't understand or test our dependencies end-to-end, or at least as far as dependency is significant, then you don't really address the most likely source of harm, which I think is very true. The biggest problem I think you're going to have is, you know, are you willing to take your business offline to do end-to-end to actually prove it? I mean, is it even possible? I think so. So Ken, your thoughts on, you know, testing at all cost? So
it comes back to that word proportion again. I'm a big fan of sectioning off what you're trying to test and get that overall viewpoint that, yeah, we've done these 10 different exercises testing. We know that each one can come up individually. I think it's actually very, very difficult to try to put together a full end-to-end test, because if you're also looking at third parties, how are you going to get third parties involved in that testing that you want to do? It's maybe not in their ideology of how they want to be shown that they are operational resilient. So I think if you try to do that end to end, it'll be very difficult to succeed and get benefit from the amount of effort you'd have to put in to do it.
Okay, thank you. Andrew, do you want to add anything before we?
Yeah, I think it's a very fair question. And obviously, when we think about testing or identifying important business services and the supporting, let's just say as a CTO, from an infrastructure perspective, an IT infrastructure perspective, absolutely. If we are only looking at the primary application that's supporting the IBS, yeah, absolutely, we are going to miss the server farm that is providing support services to all of the IBSs. So as a CTO, I think it's sort of incumbent on the IT department to understand its infrastructure, to be able to work with operational resilience to say, hey, don't stop at level 1, because actually we need to be thinking about the server farm. We need to be thinking about this server array of this hardware and this infrastructure to make sure that we don't have concentration risk on one piece of infrastructure or one server farm. But really, a really good point. And it's not one ring to rule them all. It's starting with something you can adequately answer, which is level 1. And then, of course, if you've got complex IT infrastructure, going down the layers until you have adequately answered the question.
And I think if you can get your senior management and your stakeholders on board with what they should be expecting to happen, and then they're not making assumptions about doing that full end-to-end or replicating a real incident. I think it's very key. If you've got them using the same language that you're using, it'll stop people further down the chain who think they know better and they know what they would like to do. You have that almost a template that says, this is what it means to us as an organization when we talk about testing, to be able to evidence that OpRes is proportionate.
Yeah. And just on that proportionate, to one question we had in here, which was about right on the subject, over delivering an exam question. I've spoken to many organizations that see risk management as core of their business. Excellent. They see this as strategic advantage. So over delivering the exam question actually provides benefits to meeting a regulatory obligation. You're right in that using the additional information is going to provide additional benefits. However, what we're talking about here is when people are not being pragmatic in their approach of looking at impact tolerances and delivering on what the regulator requires. If you've got surplus information you're gathering for your gap analysis that can be used elsewhere in the business, that is fantastic. But what we're looking at here is really the OpRes regulation side of it. So we've got time for 2 more questions. So one here was, if an organization is certified and matured to ISO 23001 over 2 years, can this be a great precursor for those organizations looking to evidence operational resilience? Andrew, what do you think?
I think the short answer is yes, because you've got the business continuity infrastructure in place. I guess it's really around how your business continuity management system has been implemented and kind of how that structure is. So if you're looking at it as if you're looking at your business from a departmental perspective, in other words, HR, IT, legal services, and that's how you've structured your organization, then when operational resilience comes along and it wants to look at your business from an important business services point of view, you already have the BC data there, but it's really important that you are able to, if you like, look at your organization both from a departmental perspective and an OpRes point of view. And that's where the OpRes department or the OpRes director, whoever that might be, needs to work closely with the BC team to make sure that you're answering both questions and both of those 2 elements don't live in isolation.
Okay, and we're almost out of time, so I've got one last controversial question from Sharon. Are we going to see a name change of business continuity to operational resilience? Both of them have processes, risk assessment, response to incident, maximum tolerance, test and communication. The list goes on. Quick answer, Andrew, and then Ken.
Unlikely.
Well, maybe a bit longer than that.
No, I think business continuity has its place, and obviously it looks at the business from an internal perspective. Operational resilience from a regulatory point of view answers a different question. I think whether one is a subset of another is moot. I think they both need to live alongside each other. So I don't think there's going to be a name change.
Cool. Ken, thoughts?
So a few years back, resilience, not operational resilience, but resilience was being used a lot more as a phrase with business continuity. So don't recover, make sure it doesn't happen in the first place. And when OpRes first came out, I thought, okay, I can see how these 2 are just going to merge in. But it is 2 different subjects, really. So I think the BC has to remain there to provide the foundation for the work you're doing with OpRes. So I don't see them being renamed anytime soon.
Cool, great, thank you, Ken. We are out of time. Thank you for all the questions. I'm sorry we didn't get to all of them, but really, really appreciate everything, all input. Nikki, we are at time.
No, that's brilliant. So all that's left for me to do is to wrap up today's webinar. But before we do, I'd just like to take the time for a few thank yous. I'd like to start with a big thank you to today's fantastic presenters, Paul, Andrew and Ken, for their time and expertise this afternoon. Great job, guys. Thank you also to the audience for attending today's webinar. The recording and slides will be available on the BCI website in the next few business days, so keep an eye out for that. And don't forget to visit our resource centre on the RiskConnect website for more content and webinar recordings. Right then, so all that leaves me to do is say that I hope you enjoy the rest of your day, and goodbye. Thank you.
Thank you.